Joe Biden's going to beat him like a drum. And so the way he beat him last time, he'll beat him in 2024. And I'll just submit this to your viewers and listeners, whether they like Mr. Trump or don't like him. Ask yourself, is any new person going to be voting for Mr. Trump? Has he in any way expanded his base or expanded his popularity? I get that his popularity is ardent and unyielding, but the real question is, are there any new participants that want to vote for Mr. Trump? And in those polls, the answer to that is no. If anything, his support has shrunken.
Now, the next battleground in the U.S. election campaign is the New Hampshire primary tomorrow, where Donald Trump is on course for another convincing victory over his last remaining rival for the Republican nomination, Nikki Haley. Ron DeSantis dropped out of the race after a lackluster campaign and is backing Donald Trump. This was Nikki Haley's reaction to the news.
He didn't call or inform me, and look, this is what the fellas do. The difference is I don't take politics personally. I never have, and I think that's the problem with where we are now, is you now have people who want to decide who's a good Republican, who's a bad Republican, who's a good person, who's a bad person. That's why our country is so divided. I don't judge people. I focus on policy that's going to make America stronger. I don't take politics personally. I'm not thin-skinned like Donald Trump. I think that people don't want that. They want a leader who's going to bring out the best in people and get our country going forward.
Well, despite the polls suggesting Trump has a big lead ahead of tomorrow's primary, Nikki Haley is still insisting she can win. Anthony Scaramucci is Donald Trump's former White House Director of Communications and joins us now. Good evening to you, Anthony.
Hi, Carol. Good evening.
Do you think that Donald Trump is on course for another victory in New Hampshire tomorrow and then the nomination from the Republican Party?
So I do. The short answer is yes, but I think the longer answer is barring some intervention from the Department of Justice. As you know, he's got two federal cases going, one for the insurrection and one for the theft of the top secret documents. If either of those cases are tried this year and he's convicted in one of those cases, I think that would probably stop him. But barring that, I think we're going to have a rematch. It's going to be President Biden versus former President Trump.
Let me just pick up on those points you made about the legal cases which are surrounding Donald Trump, a whole series of different legal questions that he's got to face. So far, none of those court appearances, none of that has led to any denting in his popularity. And it's hard to see how any of those cases could actually be concluded in time to stop him running, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, I agree. I agree with that. But I mean, the wheels of justice turn slowly. But there are a few things that could happen. As you will recall, there is a Supreme Court decision that will come out February, March, related to our 14th Amendment, where two states have taken Mr. Trump off of the ballot because of his threat of insurrection. And so that's right there, pretty specific in the 14th Amendment. Of course, Mr. Trump is appealing that to the Supreme Court. If the court were to rule that the 14th Amendment as it stands in its original content is valid, that would give the opportunity for many of these blue states to remove Mr. Trump from the ballot, and then he would lose his ability to get the Electoral College votes necessary to become president. So there are a few things in his way, but if you're asking me the broader question, will any of those things stop him? I'm going to say no. I think he ends up as the Republican nominee, despite the top secret document case, despite the insurrection. He's also got an election interference case in Georgia, and he has this 14th Amendment case that's going to be heard at the Supreme Court. So he is the proverbial Teflon Don, and I think he can withstand these things, and he'll probably end up as a nominee.
How do you think it is that Donald Trump, despite all those cases which you've just outlined there, despite his involvement in the January the 6th violence, despite all of that, and the fact that some Republicans have been working really hard to try to stop him, how has he managed to capture so much support across the Republican Party that he now appears unstoppable?
Well, I think anybody that voted for the Brexit in the United Kingdom would likely understand his support. And so, for myself, I grew up in a blue-collar neighborhood, and I can tell you that the blue-collar people in the United States feel disenfranchised. They feel like a group of elites have sort of stolen their aspiration in America. And so maybe 35 years ago, these were blue-collar, economically aspirational people, and now they feel like they're blue-collar, economically desperational. And so Mr. Trump represents them in their minds. He's an avatar for their anger. He's someone that will use the strength of his personality as sort of a wrecking ball against things like the media, the political establishment, the medical establishment. And so they like that. They don't like the way the system is configured right now. They think the system is unfair to them. And a result of which he has very ardent, unstoppable, unyielding support from those people. And if I could just be candid for 1 second, Governor Haley or Governor DeSantis, they had an opportunity to go after a market of other disenfranchised voters, which are the non-voters. They could have created a new market the way an entrepreneur does, but they didn't do that. They just stayed in the Republican lane, me versus Trump, as opposed to going after more aggrieved people. Barack Obama did that in 2008, and he was able to beat the establishment Democrats and rise to the presidency. So unfortunately, the candidates running against Mr. Trump have not proven to be entrepreneurial politicians.
And if, as seems likely, Donald Trump wins in New Hampshire tomorrow, he goes on to get the Republican nomination. How do you think that campaign against Joe Biden is going to play out?
Well, listen, Joe Biden's going to beat him like a drum. And so the way he beat him last time, he'll beat him in 2024. And I'll just submit this to your viewers and listeners, whether they like Mr. Trump or don't like him. Ask yourself, is any new person going to be voting for Mr. Trump? Has he in any way expanded his base or expanded his popularity? I get that his popularity is ardent and unyielding, but the real question is, are there any new participants that want to vote for Mr. Trump? And in those polls, the answer to that is no. If anything, his support has shrunken, and I think people are going to play the highlight reel of his insanity over the next 10 or so months, and he'll lose the election. Remember, the economy's doing quite well in the U.S. I think people need a reminder of that as well.
So despite all those polls showing, for example, that Donald Trump has quite a significant lead in those important swing states, and we know that when it comes to the presidential contest, it is those small number of swing states that hold the key to the result, you actually think that despite what everyone else is saying, Donald Trump's going to lose?
I do believe that, yes. And remember, we're talking now in mid to late January. That's a lifetime away, the final polling data. And, of course, the Biden campaign hasn't really even geared up their targeted response against Mr. Trump. So all of those preliminary polls are absolutely meaningless. I think the differential is, are there any new supporters for Mr. Trump? And I think the answer to that is no. And how is the economy doing under President Biden? And we have pretty good economic numbers, and I think we'll have better numbers over the next 10 months. So, listen, it's going to be a brutal contest. They have a combined age of 158 or 159 years old. Both of these guys should be into their retirement and not running. But this is what we're faced with. These are the two choices. And I think President Biden will beat them.
And despite the fact that we know that a lot of voters and a lot of analysts, and indeed quite a few Democrats, are very concerned that President Biden's age and the fact that he seems to be showing his age is going to be a major factor.
Despite all that, yes. I think ultimately they'll see him as somebody that's an institutionalist and that will protect the foundational principles of the American democracy. And I think we have to take Mr. Trump at his word that he wants to be a dictator for a day, which means more than one day, and that he wants to persecute his adversaries using what's supposed to be an impartial system, the Department of Justice. And so I think when it gets down and dirty, the American people are going to choose the preservation of their democracy over that type of sordid insanity.
If Donald Trump does win the White House for a second term, what do you think a second Trump presidency would mean? There's a lot of concern here in the UK, for example, about his concern about his approach to international institutions, his threat to pull out of NATO.
Well, Carol, I'm expecting you to write a recommendation for me for UK citizenship. Is that something you're willing to do for me?
Well, I'm sure that I would be prepared to sign any legal document that I was legally entitled to do, so long as they were views that I held honestly.
No, listen, I'm teasing you. I'm sure that I'm going to have to hide under a rock for 4 years. But the truth be told, yes, he would present a threat to the institutions of the democracy. He talked about wanting to withdraw from NATO in his second term. And so that would be his second term. I guess the good news would be he can only be president for 4 years. And I think that would be generally good for everybody, because the same way we outlasted him last year, or last time, I should say, the stresses on these institutions, I think, would be bearable. The real question is, would he try to do something to subvert the democracy? We've already seen that he's willing to foment an insurrection. Remember the chief witness for the prosecution is Mark Meadows. It's not a democratically elected prosecutor. It is a former chief of staff of his, and it's a former Freedom Caucus member, which is the hardest right wing of the House of Representatives. That's the chief witness against them. So we'll have somebody that has already threatened the system, helped to foment an insurrection, has talked about the expansion of the executive powers and the pulling out of America from NATO. I think it would put a lot of pressure on our European allies, and I think it would further hurt America's standing in the world. So for all of those reasons, I'll be working very hard to make sure he doesn't get reelected.
You talked about how this was going to be a brutal contest between Trump and Biden, if indeed that is what we see. Are we going to see debates between these two, and how important will they be?
So it's a very good question, and we may not end up seeing debates, which would be a travesty for the American people. Usually these debates are the final calling card or the final decision-making process for the American voter. But I think there's been a general reluctancy for both of these candidates to want to debate. And depending on how close the election is, we may or may not see the debates. I think that would be a real shame. It would break a long-standing tradition, and it wouldn't be fair to the American voter.
Great to speak to you. Anthony Scaramucci, who was Donald Trump's White House Director of Communications. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.